Denver, Colorado. A quiet Tuesday night. I am sitting in my kitchen, watching my own family sell my tragedy to the highest bidder. My name is Kate Thompson, and to the world I am a cautionary tale, a daughter lost to addiction and madness. My parents stand on a stage wiping away fake tears as they collect millions in my name. But they forgot one thing. I am not missing, and I am certainly not helpless. I am watching them lie, and I am about to drive back into the life I escaped to burn their empire to the ground. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The video playing on my laptop screen had over 3 million views. In the thumbnail, my mother was wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek, while my father, wearing his Sunday best, gripped her shoulder with stoic strength. My younger sister Maddie sat between them, looking like a fragile porcelain doll that had just been shattered. Above their heads hung a professionally printed banner that read, "Kate's Hope Foundation, Fighting for the Lost." I sat in my tiny city apartment, the blue light of the screen reflecting off the EMT uniform I hadn't even taken off yet. I had just finished a 12-hour shift, pulling people out of car wrecks and stabilizing overdoses in alleyways. But according to the people on the screen, I was the one who needed saving. My father leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with that rich, practiced baritone that used to mesmerize his congregation. He told the camera that his eldest daughter, Kate, was lost to the grip of severe mental illness and addiction. He said they were fighting for my life. He said I was likely on the streets, unrecognizable, a tragedy waiting to happen. I wasn't on the streets. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee, perfectly sober, fully employed, and paralyzed by a white-hot humiliation that made my hands shake. They weren't looking for me. They didn't want me back. They were using my name and a fabricated tragedy to fill their bank accounts. I watched my mother sob about how much they missed their troubled girl, and I felt a cold, sharp rage settle in my chest, replacing the exhaustion. They had turned me into a prop. To the world, I was a cautionary tale, a ghost story to solicit donations. But you need to know how I became the villain in my own family's fairy tale before I became the nightmare that destroyed it. Growing up in our small Kansas town, the Thompsons were royalty. My father, Mark, was the beloved pastor who could charm the donations out of a miser, and my mother, Elaine, was the steel-spined event organizer who made sure every potluck and charity drive looked effortless. And then there was Maddie. Beautiful, bubbly, golden-haired Maddie. The community saw us as the champions of family values, the people who would give you the shirts off their backs. But inside our house, the dynamic was medieval. I wasn't a daughter. I was a utility. If the house was messy, it was my failure. If Maddie was upset, it was my fault. I learned early on that I was useful when I was quiet, and dangerous when I had needs. When I was 10 and came home crying because a group of girls had thrown my backpack in a dumpster, my mother didn't hug me. She sighed, checked her watch, and told me to stop being so dramatic. She told me to be grateful I wasn't like Maddie, who was too delicate for this world. Resilience was demanded of me, but never nurtured. When Maddie got a C+ in math, they hired a private tutor and took her for ice cream to soothe her anxiety. When I brought home straight A's, my father just nodded and said, "Good. That's what we expect." I was invisible until I messed up, and then I was a target. The break didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion until the night of my 22nd birthday. I was home from community college for the weekend, working 2 jobs just to pay for my books because my parents claimed they couldn't afford to help me. I walked into the house hoping for a dinner, maybe a cake with my name on it. Just a small acknowledgement that I existed. The living room was exploded with pink balloons and streamers. There was a pile of gifts on the table, a brand new professional camera, a ring light, designer clothes. But they weren't for me. They were for Maddie. She had just hit 100,000 followers on Instagram, and apparently that was the milestone worth celebrating. My birthday dinner was a leftover grocery store sheet cake with a chunk missing slapped onto a paper flimsy plate. Next to it was a card that didn't say "Happy Birthday." It read, "Try to be more like Maddie. I stood there staring at the dry cake, feeling the heat rise in my face. Maddie bounced into the room, phone in hand, already live streaming. She spun the camera toward me, capturing my stunned, hurt expression for her audience. "See, guys," she chirped, zooming in on the sad plate in my hands. "We even gave my sister a snack. She's so low maintenance she doesn't even care." I saw the comments scrolling up her screen. "LOL, look at her face. She looks miserable. Aw, poor mood killer." My mother laughed from the kitchen, that indulgent soft chuckle she saved for Maddie. "Oh, Maddie, don't tease your sister." My father didn't even look up from his paper. His only comment to me was, "Careful with those crumbs, Katie. We just cleaned." I felt my throat close up. It wasn't just the neglect, it was the public degradation. I was being stripped of my dignity for content. I forced a smile that felt like it was glued to my skull, retreated to my room, and sat in the dark. Later that night, I went to get water and froze at the top of the stairs. My parents were talking in the hallway below. Their voices were low, the kind of tone you use for business deals. "Maddie is our real hope," my mother said. "She has the sparkle. She can actually take this family somewhere. Kate, she's just average. She'll never go far." "I know," my father replied, his voice dismissing me entirely. "When we're older, Maddie will be the one to take care of us. Kate will probably just drift. She's too quiet, too difficult. She just doesn't fit the picture." I sat on the darkened step, gripping the banister until my knuckles turned white. It was a cold, paralyzing emptiness. They hadn't just overlooked me. They had written me out of the future. I wasn't their child. I was a dead end. I went back to my room and closed the door with a terrifying new clarity. I stared at my worn backpack and the little cash I had stashed in a shoebox. If I stayed, I would slowly disappear until there was nothing left of me. So I chose the only thing they never imagined I'd want. I chose my freedom. I packed in total silence, moving through my room like a burglar stealing my own life. I took only what fit in my school backpack: 3 changes of clothes, a spiral-bound notebook, and a framed photo of my grandmother, the only person in that bloodline who had ever looked at me with genuine kindness. I didn't leave a note. Notes were for people who wanted to be found, or for people who thought their words would matter. I knew mine didn't. I slipped out the back door just as the sky was turning a bruised purple before dawn. The house was still sleeping, holding its breath, and for a terrifying second the floorboard creaked under my sneaker. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for my father's shout. But there was only silence. I walked to the depot and bought a one-way ticket to Denver. As the bus pulled away, watching the familiar cornfields blur into a gray smear of highway, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a hollow, vibrating terror in my chest, mixed with a tiny, flickering match strike of hope. The city hit me like a physical blow. I arrived with less than $200 and absolutely no plan. For the first 2 weeks, I slept sitting up on a bench in the bus station until security kicked me out. Then I rotated between a women's shelter that smelled of bleach and despair, and eventually a stranger's lumpy couch after answering a sketchy ad on a community board. I learned the specific burning humiliation of showering in a public shelter stall with a timer on the water. At the diner where I found a job bussing tables, coworkers would ask where I lived, and I mastered the art of the vague shrug, changing the subject before they could see the shame heat up my neck. I was hungry, tired, and scared, but every time I passed a payphone, I walked right by. Calling home would mean admitting they were right, that I couldn't survive without them. I would have starved before I let them win. My luck changed on a Tuesday night shift because of a spilled cup of coffee and a woman named Rosa. Rosa Delgado was an ER nurse who came in for pancakes after her graveyard shifts. One night, an older customer at the counter turned gray and slumped off his stool, hitting the floor hard. While the manager panicked and the other waitress screamed, I moved. I didn't think. I just slid onto my knees, checked his airway, elevated his legs, and kept his head stable until the paramedics burst in. When I stood up, wiping dust from my apron, Rosa was watching me over her coffee mug. You ever thought about EMS? She asked bluntly. You handle chaos better than most of the interns I'm training. That conversation changed everything. Rosa helped me find a cheap room in a shared house that didn't smell like bleach. She helped me navigate the paperwork for a frantic EMT training program and a small hardship grant. The next 6 months were a blur of caffeine and textbooks. I studied until 300 a.m., my hands shaking from exhaustion, memorizing anatomy and protocols. During my clinical ride-alongs, I learned to keep my hands steady while people screamed and bled. I loved it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a burden or a disappointment. I was competent. I was useful. I thought I had escaped their gravity, but a year into my new life, my past reached out to strangle me. I was called into the program administrator's office, my stomach dropping as I saw the serious look on her face. She told me they had received a concerning call from my parents. Mark and Elaine had tracked me down and told the school that I was mentally unstable, that I ran away when stressed, and that I had a history of suicidal behavior. It was a lie, a precise, calculated lie designed to ruin my credibility before I even started my career. I sat there fighting the urge to vomit and explain the truth. I showed them my grades, my attendance, my stability. I kept my spot, but the rage I felt was different this time. It wasn't the helpless anger of a child. It was the jagged defensive fury of an adult being hunted. I changed my phone number that afternoon. I blocked every email address, every social media account associated with the Thompsons. I told myself that if they wanted me gone, they were going to get their wish completely. I built a fortress around my life. 3 years passed. I became a solid EMT respected by my crew. I rented an apartment with mismatched furniture that I paid for with my own money. I had friends. I had a life. I foolishly thought I had outrun them. Then one night, Rosa came over for takeout. We were laughing about a shift when she went quiet, staring at her phone. "Kate," she said, her voice weirdly tight. "Is this you?" She turned the screen toward me. It was a clip from a local news station back in Kansas. My blood turned to ice. There on the screen stood Mark and Elaine, looking older and tragically weary. They were standing under a banner that read, "Kate's Hope Foundation, Saving Families from the Darkness of Mental Illness." They were using a cropped photo of me from high school, one where I looked pale and unsmiling, to sell the narrative. They spoke about their lost daughter, implying I was battling severe addiction, or worse, that I was dead. "We just pray our Katie forgives us. One day. If she's still out there," my mother sobbed into the microphone. I stared at the donation link flashing at the bottom of the screen. They weren't just lying. They were monetizing my absence. They had turned me into a profitable corpse while I was out here saving lives. I shut off the screen, the silence in the room heavy and suffocating. They wanted a tragic story, so I decided I was going to give them one. Just not the ending they wrote for me. I took 2 weeks of vacation time, telling my captain I had family business to settle. It was the truth, just not the kind involving reunions or casseroles. The bus ride back to Kansas felt less like a homecoming and more like a deployment into a war zone constructed entirely of my own trauma. As the bus rolled past the "Welcome to Maple Ridge" sign, my chest tightened. The town looked sickeningly identical to how I left it. The white steeple of the church pierced the sky like a needle. The diner still had the same peeling paint, and the high school football field was perfectly manicured, a green altar to the town's only other religion. I felt like a ghost haunting my own history, invisible, but seeing everything with a terrifying sharpness. My first stop wasn't the house. It was the loading dock behind the grocery store. Aunt Linda, my mother's quiet cousin, who had spent decades blending into the wallpaper, was waiting in her sedan. Linda had always been the silent observer, the one who saw the bruises on my self-esteem, but never had the power to stop them. Now she was my mole. She looked terrified as I slid into the passenger seat, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She confessed that she had been disgusted by Mark and Elaine for years, watching them funnel donation money into renovations for their own kitchen and consulting fees for Maddie's influencer brand. She handed me a manila envelope and a flash drive. "They forged your signature on the intake forms," she whispered. And I recorded their strategy meetings. Kate, they talk about you like you're a marketing campaign. I plugged the drive into my laptop right there in the car. The video was shaky, filmed secretly from a phone propped on a shelf, but the audio was crystal clear. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table. "If she doesn't come back," my mother's voice said, cool and detached. "We frame it as grief. People love redemption arcs. We can probably get the new roof out of the fall fundraiser if we play up the searching for answers angle." I felt a wave of nausea crash into a sense of dark vindication. They weren't just bad parents, they were predators. I spent the next 2 days moving through the town like a shadow. I met with Mrs. Harrell, the former church treasurer, who had quietly resigned 6 months ago. She was hesitant until I showed her my EMT badge proof that I wasn't the addict they painted me as. She opened the floodgates. She showed me copies of ledgers where donor funds meant for addiction counseling had simply vanished. I visited a local therapist who admitted she had stopped referring families to the foundation because the promised financial aid never materialized. My parents were preying on desperate families, using their faith as a weapon to strip them of hope and cash. It was at a gas station on the edge of town that my anonymity finally cracked. I was pumping gas when a voice behind me said, "Kate." I turned to see Daniel Reyes, my old neighbor and childhood friend. He was taller now, wearing a firefighter's t-shirt and looking at me like he was seeing an apparition. "My God," he breathed. "They told us. They said you were in rehab. Or worse. They said you couldn't be contacted." I told him everything. I told him about the ambulance, the apartment, the lies. Daniel didn't try to offer platitudes. His face hardened into a look of quiet, righteous anger. "I can get you the fire inspection logs for the church," he said. "And I know a guy in the city clerk's office. He didn't try to save me, he just offered to hand me the ammunition I needed." The final blow came when Linda helped me access the county clerk's archives. We pulled a file that made the breath catch in my throat. While I was sleeping in shelters and working double shifts to build a life, Mark and Elaine had filed papers, declaring me legally mentally incompetent. They had used that status to drain an old college fund my grandmother had left me, and to cash out a small insurance settlement from a fender bender I'd been in years ago. They had legally erased my autonomy. They had told the state of Kansas that I was too broken to think for myself, all so they could steal the only money that was rightfully mine. I stood in the dusty records room staring at the forged signatures, feeling a violation deeper than neglect. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had tried to delete me. Then I saw the flyer. The church was hosting a gala for hope in 3 days. It was going to be live-streamed. The guest list included the mayor, local news anchors, and the town's wealthiest donors. It was their biggest stage, yet the crowning jewel of their scam. I realized with a cold certainty that this was it. If I exposed them in private, they would spin it. They would gaslight the town and paint me as the unstable, jealous daughter. But if I did it there, there would be no spin. We spent the next 48 hours in a war room mentality. Me, Linda, Daniel, and Mrs. Harrell assembled the evidence. We had the financial printouts, the damning video recordings, the forged incompetence papers, and my current employment records proving my sanity. I felt a strange mix of panic and grim determination. I was about to blow up not just my parents, but the entire community that worshipped them. But as I looked at the evidence of the families they scammed, I knew I had no choice. If the only way to save this town was to burn down the lie it worshipped, I was willing to light the match. The night of the gala, the air was crisp. I walked toward the church dressed in black slacks and a blazer, clutching a folder and the flash drive. The parking lot was full. I could hear the muffled sound of worship music bleeding through the walls. My heart was pounding against my ribs, echoing the rhythm of the night I ran away, but the fear was gone. I put my hand on the heavy oak door handle. I wasn't running out this time. I was walking in. The lobby of the church had been transformed into a grotesque marketplace of sympathy. Fairy lights strung from the ceiling cast a warm, inviting glow over tables stacked with merchandise, t-shirts, wristbands, and tote bags, all emblazoned with my high school graduation photo and the slogan, "Help Bring Katie Home." I stood in the shadows of the vestibule, watching people scan QR codes to donate, sickened by the efficiency of it all. Near the entrance to the sanctuary, Maddie was posing for selfies with a group of teenage girls, perfecting her sad but hopeful smile, while my parents worked the room of wealthy donors, shaking hands with the practiced solemnity of grieving saints. It was a production, a well-oiled machine fueled by my supposed destruction. I felt a weird, detached calm settle over me, the kind of icy focus I felt when I intubated a patient in the back of a speeding ambulance. It was all going to end tonight. I waited until the lights dimmed and the live stream began. I slipped into the back of the sanctuary just as my father took the podium. A giant screen behind him broadcast his face to the overflow room and the thousands watching online. He launched into his sermon, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about losing his firstborn to the darkness. He twisted scripture to justify their narrative, talking about the prodigal child not as a story of forgiveness, but as a burden the family had to bear. Then it was my mother's turn. She dabbed at dry eyes, her voice trembling as she expressed her deepest regret for not seeing the signs of my illness earlier. Finally, Maddie took the mic. She looked small and vulnerable in the spotlight. "If Katie is watching," she whispered, looking directly into the camera with tears that I knew she could summon on command, "please come home. We love you. We just want you safe." The room was heavy with sniffles and murmured amens. My father stepped back up, asking everyone to bow their heads in prayer for my lost soul. That was my cue. I didn't run. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The sound cut through the reverent silence like a gunshot. Heads began to lift. A ripple of gasps moved through the pews as people recognized the face from the banners. My father froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening in genuine horror. I didn't stop until I was standing at the foot of the stage, looking up at the three people who had sold me out. "You don't get to pray for me and profit off me at the same time," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the sanctuary, it carried to the back row. My father gripped the podium. "Kate," he stammered, his charisma fracturing. "Kate, oh, thank God you're unwell, sweetheart. Let's go to the office and—" "I'm not going anywhere," I said, turning to face the camera that was still broadcasting. I looked directly into the lens, addressing the room and the internet simultaneously. "My name is Kate Thompson. I am 26 years old. I am a licensed emergency medical technician in Denver. I have been sober, employed, and fully independent for 4 years. And I am not missing." "She's having an episode!" my mother shrieked, rushing forward, her martyr mask slipping into panic. "Cut the feed! Someone help her! Don't touch the feed!" I ordered, my voice sharpening into the command tone I used on fire scenes. I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and held it up. "Linda now." In the tech booth at the back, Aunt Linda bypassed the church's scheduled programming and plugged in my drive. The giant screen behind my parents flickered, replacing the Kate's Hope logo with a scanned document. It was the incompetency filing. "This is a petition my parents filed to declare me mentally unfit," I explained, pointing to the screen. "They filed this while I was working 60-hour weeks saving lives, just so they could access a trust fund my grandmother left me." The image changed. Bank statements appeared, highlighted in yellow. "And this," I continued, "is the ledger for the foundation. You donated money for addiction counseling. That money went to a remodel of the parsonage, a luxury lease on a vehicle for my sister, and consulting fees paid directly to my father." The room erupted into confused murmurs. My father was shouting now, trying to drown me out. "These are lies. She's sick. She's vindictive. And this," I said, raising my voice over his, "is what they really think of their cause." The audio played over the sanctuary speakers, loud and undeniable. It was the recording Linda had taken in the kitchen. My father's voice boomed through the hall. "Either way, she's valuable to the brand." Then my mother's voice, clear as day. "If she doesn't come back, we frame it as grief. People love redemption arcs." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother looked like she had been slapped. Maddie, realizing the camera was still on her, abandoned the act entirely. Her face twisted into a sneer. "You jealous bitch," she hissed, forgetting to cover her microphone. "You're ruining everything because you couldn't hack it." I looked at my sister, not with anger, but with a pity that seemed to infuriate her more. "I'm not jealous, Maddie. I'm just the receipts." I turned back to my parents. "You told the world I was in rehab when I was escaping your house. You told the world I was an addict because I wouldn't let you control me. You remember my 22nd birthday, the half-eaten cake, the way you let thousands of people mock me online. You didn't lose a daughter to darkness, Dad. You drove her away because she didn't fit your profit margin." A wealthy donor in the second row stood up. "Is this true, Pastor?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Did my money go to your car?" "It's a fabrication," Mark yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "Technological manipulation." But it was over. Mrs. Harrell and the other former treasurer stood up from the back, shouting that the documents were real. The live stream chat displayed on a side monitor was scrolling so fast it was a blur of fraud, scam, and WTF. Then the wail of sirens cut through the air outside. Daniel had timed it perfectly. The back doors swung open and 2 police officers accompanied by a state investigator walked in. They didn't come for me. They walked straight down the aisle toward the stage. An official in a suit stepped up to the podium flashing a badge. "Mark and Elaine Thompson, I need you to step down. We have a warrant to seize all financial records regarding the Kate's Hope Foundation." My mother collapsed into a pew, sobbing for real this time. My father tried to argue, puffing up his chest, but he looked small-cornered and utterly defeated. Maddie was frantically trying to delete things off her phone, but the internet is forever. I felt a sudden lightness in my head, a rush of oxygen, like I had been holding my breath for a decade. I didn't stay to watch them get cuffed. I didn't need to see the ruin. I just needed to know the lie was dead. I turned my back on the chaos, on the shouting donors, on the flashing cameras. I walked back up the aisle, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I pushed open the heavy church doors and stepped out into the cool, dark night. The air tasted sweet. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to defend myself. The truth was doing it for me. The fallout wasn't a ripple. It was a landslide. Over the next few weeks, local news vans camped out on the lawn where I used to play tag, broadcasting the collapse of the Thompson Empire. The Kate's Hope Foundation was frozen, its assets seized, and my parents were formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of funds. The church, once their fortress, cracked down the middle. Half the congregation resigned in disgust, while the other half clung to my father's innocence, sending me hate mail that called me a traitor, an ungrateful daughter, and a liar. But for every letter dripping with venom, I received 2 from strangers thanking me for freeing them from the guilt my parents had weaponized. Maddie's fall was faster and louder. Without the curated tragedy of her missing sister to prop up her content, her engagement tanked. Sponsors dropped her overnight, terrified of being associated with a fraud investigation. One night my phone buzzed with a text from her. "You destroyed my career because you hate me. I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about the little girl she used to be before she became a brand. I didn't feel joy, and I certainly didn't feel satisfaction. I felt a complicated, heavy grief for the sister I never really had. I typed back a single sentence: "I didn't destroy your life. I just stopped letting you build it on mine." She never replied. The legal closure came 3 months later. I returned to Kansas one last time to testify. Walking into the courtroom felt like stepping into a sealed vacuum. My parents sat at the defense table. Mark refused to look at me, staring intensely at a spot on the wall, his posture shrunken and defeated. Elaine, however, glared at me with wet, red-rimmed eyes, looking at me not like a daughter, but like a Judas. My testimony was calm, detailed, and devastating. I described how they stripped me of my legal autonomy, how they siphoned my future to pave their driveway, and how they sold my suffering to the highest bidder. The judge listened intently, acknowledging the severity of the abuse in his final remarks. He ordered full restitution. The funds taken in my name were to be repaid. I didn't ask for extra damages or pain and suffering. I requested that the recovered money be redirected to a legitimate mental health nonprofit in the city. My revenge wasn't about taking their money. It was about ensuring they could never use my name to take anyone else's. Back in Denver, life didn't magically become a fairy tale, but it became mine. I continued working as an EMT, but the heaviness in my chest was gone. I started volunteering once a month with a real community outreach program, using my story carefully and only on my terms. I built a small, impenetrable circle of people who knew the real me, Rosa, who still treated me like a little sister, and Daniel, who had moved out to the city to be closer. We weren't rushing anything, but having him there, a piece of my past that didn't hurt, was a comfort I hadn't expected. I still had bad nights. I still woke up sweating from nightmares where I was trapped in that house, invisible and screaming. But I also had quiet mornings where I drank coffee in my mismatched kitchen and realized that no one was watching, no one was judging, and no one was capitalizing on my existence. Before the bank finally foreclosed on my childhood home, I went back to collect a few boxes I had left behind in the attic. The house felt hollow, stripped of the furniture and the pretense. I walked into my old bedroom, the walls still painted a pale yellow I had always hated. In the back of a junk drawer, I found the birthday card from years ago. Try to be more like Maddie. It was crumpled, the ink faded. I took it out to the backyard, carrying a small metal mixing bowl and a lighter. The air was cold, smelling of dried leaves and coming winter. I placed the card in the bowl and flicked the lighter. The flame caught the corner of the paper, curling the edges black. I watched the words disappear, consumed by the fire, until there was nothing left but a pile of gray ash. I didn't cry. I didn't make a speech. I just let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since I was 10 years old. It was a deep, solid exhale, a physical weight slipping off my spine. The sun was rising over the Denver skyline when I finished my shift the next morning. I sat in the back of the ambulance, the doors open to the cool dawn air. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had held a half-eaten cake on a paper plate, the hands that had packed a backpack in the dark, and the hands that had held a microphone and set my story on fire. I knew I would likely never forgive them. Some things are too broken to be fixed, and some betrayals are too deliberate to be absolved. But as the sun hit the glass of the skyscrapers, turning the city into gold, I realized they no longer owned my name, my future, or my narrative. My family wanted me to be a tragedy they could sell. I became something worse for them, and better for me, a woman they could never again control. And for the first time in my life, that word people throw around so casually, freedom, finally felt like mine. Kate finally found her peace, but it took burning down the falsehoods to get there. It is a stark reminder that sometimes you have to walk away to truly save yourself. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in her position. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.